Chapter 1. The Anniversary Banquet. The Hawthorne Hotel stood at the edge of Brindle Ash, a market town nestled among rolling hills and winding hedgerows in the summer of 1958. Built of honey-coloured stone and crowned with ivy-covered gables, it had long been regarded as the town's pride. Travellers from London often stopped there on their way westward, while locals spoke of it with a peculiar mixture of affection and possessiveness, as though the building itself belonged to every resident. On the evening of June 21st, the hotel celebrated its 50th anniversary. The occasion had been discussed for months. Bunting hung from windows. Flower arrangements filled every corner of the lobby. The brass fittings shone so brightly that several guests remarked they could see their reflections in them. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was crowded. At one table sat retired Colonel Arthur Fenwick and his wife Margaret. Nearby was Dr. Peter Mallory, who had practiced medicine in Brindle Ash for nearly 20 years. Across the room, Councillor Harold Baines entertained a group of businessmen with stories that became more elaborate each time he told them. The guest of honour was the hotel's owner, Victor Hawthorne. At 62, Victor remained an imposing figure. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his dinner jacket fitted impeccably, his voice carried naturally across a room without ever seeming loud. Many admired him, some feared him, a few hated him, though none openly admitted it. Near the entrance stood Miss Jane Marple. She had arrived only that afternoon to spend a fortnight with an old school friend who lived nearby. The anniversary banquet happened to coincide with her visit, and an invitation had quickly appeared. Miss Marple accepted because she enjoyed observing people. A gathering such as this offered opportunities one seldom found elsewhere. "Such a handsome room," remarked her companion, Mrs. Edith Ramsay. "It is indeed," said Miss Marple. Her eyes drifted across the guests. People often imagined that Miss Marple spent her time examining clues. In truth, she spent most of it examining people. The ballroom reminded her of a village fete. The clothing was finer, the speeches were longer. Human nature remained precisely the same. At a table near the dance floor sat Victor Hawthorne's niece, Celia Hawthorne. She was 32, strikingly attractive, and seemed distracted. Twice she checked the clock above the fireplace. 3 times she glanced toward the entrance. Meanwhile, a tall man in a dark suit watched her from across the room. Miss Marple noticed. She did not appear to notice. That was often useful. At 7:30, Victor rose to deliver his speech. Conversations ceased. Glasses were lowered. Even the musicians fell silent. Victor smiled broadly. "My friends," he began. "50 years ago, my father opened the doors of this hotel. He possessed very little money, but a great deal of determination." Polite laughter followed. Victor continued. He spoke of the hotel's history, its struggles during the war, its growth afterward, its reputation throughout the county. The audience applauded generously. Then Victor's expression changed. Only slightly, yet Miss Marple observed it. The smile became thinner, the eyes harder. "As many of you know," he said, "business is not always easy. One occasionally discovers that trust has been misplaced." A murmur passed through the room. Several guests exchanged glances. Victor raised his glass. Fortunately, unpleasant matters have a way of sorting themselves out. The remark seemed oddly directed. Toward whom, no one could say. A few people laughed uncertainly. Others did not. Miss Marple noticed Dr. Mallory looking down at his plate. She noticed Celia stiffen. She noticed Councillor Baines suddenly lose interest in his wine. Most importantly, she noticed Victor himself. He appeared satisfied, as though he had delivered a private message hidden within a public speech. The banquet continued. Dinner was served, conversations resumed. A string quartet began to play. Yet something subtle had shifted. One sensed it without being able to define it. Around 9 o'clock, Miss Marple found herself speaking with the hotel's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Pike. The woman had worked at Hawthorne Hotel for nearly 30 years. "I expect you're very proud of tonight," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Pike hesitated. "Of the hotel, certainly. Not of the celebration." The housekeeper gave a small smile. "Large families aren't always as happy as they appear." Miss Marple nodded. That sounded entirely familiar. The observation could have described half the households in St. Mary Mead. Before she could ask another question, someone called Mrs. Pike away. The housekeeper departed quickly. Miss Marple watched her go. There had been worry in the woman's face. Real worry, not merely irritation or fatigue. Elsewhere, Victor Hawthorne was entertaining guests beside the ballroom fireplace. He appeared cheerful once again, yet several times his gaze drifted toward a young waiter carrying champagne. The waiter seemed nervous, extremely nervous. At one point he nearly dropped an entire tray. Victor frowned. The waiter paled. An ordinary observer might have dismissed the exchange. Miss Marple did not. Later, while collecting a fresh cup of coffee, she happened to overhear a fragment of conversation. It came from the terrace doors. The speakers believed themselves alone. One was Celia Hawthorne. The other was the tall man who had watched her earlier. "You promised," Celia whispered. "I know." "Then why are you still here?" "I couldn't leave. He's going to tell them." The man's voice lowered. Miss Marple caught only a few words. "Documents. Tomorrow morning." Too late then. Footsteps approached. The conversation ended instantly. Both speakers moved away. Miss Marple returned calmly to her coffee. She had no idea what the discussion meant. That did not matter. Information often became useful later. At 10 o'clock, dancing began. The ballroom filled with music and movement. Couples crossed the polished floor. Guests laughed. Photographs were taken. Champagne flowed generously. For a time, the atmosphere appeared festive once more. Only a handful of people noticed Victor Hawthorne leave the ballroom. He slipped through a side door leading toward the private offices. Miss Marple happened to be one of them, not because she was watching him, because she was watching everyone. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Victor did not return. No one seemed concerned. A host had many responsibilities during such an event. The evening continued. At 11 o'clock, Councillor Baines attempted a comic song that received more politeness than enthusiasm. By 11:15, several guests began discussing departures. By 11:30, the anniversary cake was wheeled into the ballroom. The crowd applauded. Yet there was still no sign of Victor Hawthorne. His absence finally attracted attention. "Where has he vanished to?" someone asked. "Probably checking accounts," another replied. "On his anniversary? That sounds exactly like Victor." The explanation satisfied most people, not all. Miss Marple noticed Celia staring repeatedly toward the same side corridor through which her uncle had disappeared. The young woman's face had become noticeably pale. Then came the scream. Sharp, female, terrified. The sound cut through the ballroom like a knife. Music stopped instantly. Several glasses shattered. For a second nobody moved, then everyone moved at once. Guests rushed toward the corridor. Chairs overturned. Voices rose in confusion. Miss Marple followed more slowly. Experience had taught her that running rarely improved one's understanding of events. The scream had come from Victor Hawthorne's private office. When she reached the doorway, a crowd had already gathered. Dr. Mallory pushed through first. Several others followed. A stunned silence filled the corridor. Then Miss Marple saw why. Victor Hawthorne sat behind his desk, or rather he remained seated there. His body leaned slightly forward. One hand rested near an open ledger. The other hung limply beside the chair. His eyes stared blankly toward the floor. A silk cord was looped tightly around his neck. The marks were unmistakable. There could be no mistake. Victor Hawthorne was dead. No one spoke for several seconds. The room seemed frozen. Then voices erupted all at once. "My God! Someone fetch the police! How did this happen? Was anyone with him?" Dr. Mallory examined the body briefly. When he finally stood, his face was grim. "He has been dead for some time." The statement echoed through the room. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, quiet, unobtrusive, looking, only looking. The office appeared tidy, too tidy. The desk contained orderly stacks of papers. A safe stood open in the corner. An empty glass rested beside Victor's chair. Nothing seemed disturbed, except for one peculiar detail. A single ballroom invitation lay on the carpet, not on the desk, not beside the chair, on the far side of the room, near the window. Miss Marple's eyes lingered upon it, just for a moment. Then she turned her attention elsewhere. Outside, somewhere beyond the hotel grounds, a church clock struck midnight. The anniversary celebration was over, and Brindle Ash had gained a murderer. Chapter 2. Rumours Before Breakfast. The news travelled through Brindle Ash before sunrise. No one could later explain precisely how. The police had not issued a statement. The newspapers knew nothing. Most of the townspeople had been asleep when Victor Hawthorne's body was discovered. Yet by 7 o'clock the next morning, shopkeepers were discussing the murder over breakfast tea, farmers exchanged theories across hedges, and nearly every resident seemed to possess some version of the story. The details varied wildly. In one account, Victor had been shot. In another, he had been stabbed. One particularly imaginative version insisted he had been found locked inside the hotel safe. Human beings, Miss Marple often reflected, had a remarkable talent for improving facts. She sat with Mrs. Edith Ramsay in the latter's garden, enjoying a quiet breakfast beneath a striped parasol. The morning was bright and pleasantly warm. Birds sang from nearby hedges. A milk cart rattled along the lane. The peaceful surroundings seemed almost absurd after the previous night's events. "I hardly slept," Edith confessed. "I don't believe many people did. They say the police were there until 3 in the morning. That sounds likely. And poor Celia," Miss Marple buttered a piece of toast. "Yes, she must be devastated." Miss Marple nodded politely, yet her thoughts remained elsewhere. Grief took many forms. Celia Hawthorne had certainly appeared distressed. The question was whether she had been distressed by her uncle's death, by something connected to it, or by something entirely different. Such distinctions mattered. The gate clicked open. A neighbour entered without ceremony. Mrs. Beatrice Holloway possessed the rare ability to appear unexpectedly while somehow carrying every piece of local gossip currently in circulation. She settled herself into a chair. "I knew you'd want the latest developments." Edith smiled faintly. "You always do." Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice dramatically. "They've questioned Daniel Mercer." Miss Marple looked up. "The gentleman in the dark suit?" Mrs. Holloway blinked. "Why, yes. How did you know?" "I noticed him at the banquet. Apparently he argued with Victor earlier in the evening." "Did he indeed?" "Oh, yes." Mrs. Holloway leaned forward. "My cousin's daughter works at the hotel. She says voices were heard in the library shortly before dinner." "Voices?" asked Edith. "Raised voices." The neighbour paused for effect. Victor threatened to expose him. Miss Marple sipped her tea. That particular phrase had already appeared twice. Once during the overheard conversation on the terrace, and once in Victor's curious speech. "Interesting. Very interesting. What does Mr. Mercer do?" she asked. "No one seems entirely certain. That is unusual." "Exactly." Mrs. Holloway looked delighted. "Some say he's an accountant. Others say he worked abroad." The uncertainty pleased her enormously. Mystery was always more enjoyable when accompanied by speculation. After another 10 minutes of theories, predictions, and unsupported conclusions, she departed to spread her information elsewhere. Edith shook her head. "That woman could generate enough conversation to power a railway station." Miss Marple smiled. "She's rather useful." "Useful? Oh yes. How?" "People tell her everything." At 9:30, Miss Marple walked into town. The police had established a visible presence around Hawthorne Hotel. Uniformed officers stood near the entrance. Guests who had remained overnight were being interviewed. Several curious residents loitered nearby in hopes of overhearing something interesting. Miss Marple passed through the crowd unnoticed. She entered a small bookshop opposite the hotel and selected a gardening magazine. The proprietor, Mr. Finch, required no encouragement whatsoever. Terrible business. Indeed, I never trusted Victor Hawthorne. Miss Marple turned a page. Didn't you? No. The bookseller lowered his voice. He had a way of making people nervous. How so? He knew things. Miss Marple looked up. What sort of things? Mr. Finch hesitated. Then he glanced around the empty shop. Secrets. The answer came quietly. He always knew secrets. The remark lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after she left. Secrets. That word seemed to accompany Victor Hawthorne wherever he went. At 11 o'clock, Inspector Leonard Graves arrived from county headquarters. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with thoughtful eyes and a patient manner. Unlike certain policemen Miss Marple had encountered over the years, he did not assume that age automatically produced foolishness, nor did he assume elderly ladies knew nothing. These qualities immediately improved his standing. The inspector established a temporary office inside the hotel. Witnesses were summoned one after another. Statements were taken. Timelines were assembled. Gradually, the evening's events began to take shape. Victor Hawthorne had left the ballroom shortly after 10 o'clock. Several witnesses confirmed seeing him enter his private office. No one could state with certainty who entered afterward. Many guests had been moving through corridors throughout the evening. Several people possessed opportunities. Unfortunately, opportunity was not evidence. Inspector Graves soon discovered another complication. Victor Hawthorne had not been popular. The victim's financial records revealed numerous disputes. His personal correspondence suggested even more. By lunchtime, the list of individuals who might have wished him harm had become alarmingly long. Among them was Daniel Mercer. The mysterious visitor quickly attracted attention. His background proved difficult to verify. He had arrived at the hotel 3 weeks earlier. He claimed to be conducting business in the area. Beyond that, little seemed known. More significantly, witnesses confirmed that he had argued privately with Victor. When questioned, Daniel admitted it. Yes, he said calmly, I argued with him. Inspector Graves studied him. About what? A personal matter. What personal matter? Daniel hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. I'd rather not say. The inspector's expression hardened. This is a murder investigation. Daniel looked away. Finally he answered, Celia. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The inspector folded his arms. Miss Hawthorne? Yes. You are acquainted. Daniel smiled faintly. We planned to marry. That revelation spread through the hotel with astonishing speed. Within an hour, everyone seemed to know. Within 2 hours, everyone seemed to have known all along. Miss Marple was sitting in the lounge when Celia herself was questioned. The young woman appeared exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly. Inspector Graves approached carefully. Miss Hawthorne, I understand you were engaged to Mr. Mercer. Celia nodded. My uncle disapproved. Why? He believed Daniel was unsuitable. Did he explain why? No. The answer arrived too quickly. Inspector Graves noticed. So did Miss Marple. A second later, Celia corrected herself. Not exactly. What does that mean? She swallowed. He said Daniel wasn't who he claimed to be. The inspector leaned forward. Did he provide evidence? No. Did you believe him? For several seconds she remained silent. Then she said softly, I didn't know what to believe. That answer sounded genuine. Miss Marple filed it away. People lied often. They rarely lied in exactly the same way as the truth. By late afternoon, the investigation seemed to be narrowing. Daniel Mercer possessed motive. He had argued with the victim. He had been seen near the office corridor. His background remained unclear. Several officers openly considered him the strongest suspect. Inspector Graves was more cautious. yet even he could not ignore the circumstances. As for Miss Marple, she spent much of the afternoon wandering the hotel grounds. This activity appeared harmless. It was not. Observation rarely looked impressive. That was one reason it worked. Near the rear gardens, she encountered Mrs. Agnes Pike. The housekeeper looked tired. Very tired. "Terrible business," said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Pike nodded. "Yes. You worked for Mr. Hawthorne a long time. Nearly 30 years. That must make this difficult." The woman gave a strange little laugh. Difficult is one word for it. Something in her tone caught Miss Marple's attention. Not grief. Not relief. Something more complicated. "Mr. Hawthorne could be demanding," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Pike looked at her sharply. Then, to Miss Marple's surprise, the woman spoke. "He frightened people." The words emerged suddenly, as though they had been waiting a long time. He knew exactly where to hurt them. Miss Marple said nothing. Silence often encouraged honesty. He collected information. Mrs. Pike stared toward the hotel. Everyone thought he was merely curious. She shook her head. He wasn't. What was he? The housekeeper hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "He kept records." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of records?" Mrs. Pike appeared immediately alarmed by her own confession. "I shouldn't have said anything. You needn't tell me more." But the woman already regretted speaking. A moment later she hurried away. Miss Marple remained where she was. Records, secrets, exposure, threats. The same ideas appeared again and again, like pieces of a pattern slowly emerging from fog. That evening, shortly before dinner, Inspector Graves received a significant development. One of the waiters remembered seeing Daniel Mercer near Victor's office shortly before the estimated time of death. The statement caused considerable excitement. Several officers regarded it as confirmation. The case seemed almost solved. When the inspector later mentioned the development to Miss Marple, he appeared thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Something troubles you," she observed. He smiled. "Does it show?" "A little." Graves folded his arms. "The evidence points toward Mercer. But it feels neat." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Murders seldom arrange themselves neatly." "Exactly." The inspector glanced toward the hotel. "I dislike cases that become obvious too quickly." Miss Marple nodded. "So do I." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple asked an apparently innocent question. "The invitation found near the office window." Inspector Graves looked surprised. "You noticed that?" "Yes. It belonged to Victor." "How curious." The inspector studied her. "Why curious?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because people usually drop things where they stand. And Mr. Hawthorne was sitting at his desk." The inspector's expression changed slightly. It was the expression of a man who had just remembered something important. As twilight settled over Brindle Ash, the investigation appeared to be moving steadily toward Daniel Mercer. Most of the town had already convicted him. The police had not. Miss Marple certainly had not. For one thing, there remained the matter of Victor Hawthorne's secrets. For another, there remained the curious behavior of several people who seemed far more frightened than grief-stricken. And finally, there remained a simple question. If Victor Hawthorne had truly intended to expose someone the following morning, what exactly had he discovered? And who had the most to lose from its revelation? Chapter 3. The Ledger That Wasn't There. Rain arrived during the night. Not a violent storm, merely a steady summer rainfall that washed the dust from windows and darkened the stone walls of Hawthorne Hotel. By morning, Brindle Ash seemed quieter. The murder remained the only subject of conversation, yet the first excitement had faded. Speculation was giving way to something more practical. People wanted answers. Inspector Leonard Graves wanted them even more. At 9 o'clock, he assembled several officers inside Victor Hawthorne's office. The room had remained largely untouched since the discovery of the body. Photographs had been taken, measurements recorded, documents catalogued. Yet one difficulty continued to trouble the investigation. No clear motive had emerged. Plenty of people disliked Victor Hawthorne. That alone was insufficient. The inspector stood beside the desk. "What do we actually know?" he asked. Sergeant Collins consulted his notes. Victim left the ballroom shortly after 10. Yes. Estimated time of death between 10:15 and 10:45. Continue. No sign of forced entry. Anything missing? The sergeant hesitated. "We can't be certain." Inspector Graves frowned. "Why not?" "Because nobody seems entirely sure what should be here." That, unfortunately, was true. Victor's office contained filing cabinets, ledgers, correspondence, contracts, account books, and decades of accumulated paperwork. Determining whether one item had vanished among thousands was no simple task. The inspector moved toward the open safe. What was stored here? No one knows. Surely someone must know. Apparently not. The sergeant sounded increasingly irritated. Mr. Hawthorne handled many matters personally. Inspector Graves sighed. Murders were difficult enough. Murders involving private businessmen often proved worse. Important documents had an inconvenient habit of disappearing. After the meeting ended, Graves continued examining the office alone. Something bothered him. Not merely the murder itself. Something about the room, the arrangement, the atmosphere, the sense that a piece of the puzzle remained hidden. He could not yet identify it. Meanwhile, Miss Marple occupied herself elsewhere. She spent the morning in the hotel lounge knitting. At least, that was how it appeared. In reality, she was listening. Listening required patience. Fortunately, patience had always been one of her strengths. Guests spoke more freely when they believed nobody cared about their conversations. Near the fireplace, two businessmen discussed Victor's affairs. "We had information on everyone." "Blackmail?" "I didn't say that." "You implied it." The first man lowered his voice. "I merely said he collected things." "What things?" "Papers, letters, records." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. There was that word again, records. Elsewhere, a chambermaid spoke with a waitress. "Always writing in that little notebook." "What notebook?" "The black one. I never saw it. Hardly anyone did." The chambermaid glanced around. He kept it with him constantly. Miss Marple's hands paused, only for a fraction of a second. Then the knitting resumed. A notebook. That was new. Very new. An hour later, she happened to encounter Inspector Graves in the lobby. "Good morning, Inspector." "Miss Marple." "You appear thoughtful." "I usually am." "How fortunate." The inspector smiled despite himself. "You sound as though thoughtfulness is a rare condition." "It often is," he laughed. Then she asked, "Did Mr. Hawthorne keep a notebook?" The reaction was immediate. His expression sharpened. "Who told you that?" "No one directly." "Interesting. So he did. We've heard references." Miss Marple folded her knitting. "Have you found it?" "No." The answer hung between them. "No notebook?" "No notebook." "That seems unfortunate." Inspector Graves nodded slowly. "Very unfortunate. Because if Victor Hawthorne truly maintained private records, the missing notebook might explain everything. Or almost everything. The possibility transformed the investigation. The search began immediately. Hotel staff were questioned again. Bedrooms were examined. Storage rooms inspected. Waste bins emptied. Nothing appeared. The notebook had vanished. Whether before or after the murder remained unknown. By afternoon, another development emerged. This one concerned Councillor Harold Baines. The councillor arrived at the police office looking distinctly uncomfortable. His usual confidence seemed diminished. Inspector Graves invited him to sit. Baines remained standing. "There is something I ought to mention." The inspector waited. "Victor and I had a disagreement. Many people did. This one was recent." "How recent?" "Yesterday." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "About what?" The councillor tugged nervously at his collar. "A property transaction." "What kind of transaction?" Baines hesitated, then answered reluctantly. one that wasn't entirely proper. Silence followed. The inspector allowed it. Eventually, Baines continued. Victor discovered certain irregularities. And? He threatened to expose them. There it was again. Expose. Reveal. Disclose. The same theme repeated endlessly. Did you threaten him? Asked Graves. No. Did you wish him harm? Certainly not. The answer arrived too quickly. Inspector Graves made a note. People often believed speed created credibility. Usually, it achieved the opposite. After Baines departed, the inspector's suspect list grew longer, not shorter. That evening, Miss Marple visited the hotel gardens. The rain had stopped. Water droplets clung to roses. The scent of damp earth lingered pleasantly in the air. Several guests wandered the pathways. Among them was Dr. Peter Mallory. He stood alone beside a stone sundial. At first glance he appeared calm. Closer observation suggested otherwise. Miss Marple approached. "Good evening, Doctor." He smiled politely. "Miss Marple. A difficult few days." Indeed. They walked together for a short distance. Eventually Miss Marple remarked, "You knew Mr. Hawthorne well." The doctor gave a curious little laugh. Did anyone truly know Victor? Perhaps not. He preferred knowing other people. The remark interested her, rather than being known himself. Precisely. Dr. Mallory stopped walking. For a moment he seemed on the verge of saying something more. Then he changed his mind. The hesitation did not escape Miss Marple. "Doctor." He looked away. "There are matters better left buried." "Are there?" "Usually." Miss Marple thought of numerous examples proving otherwise. Before she could continue, the doctor excused himself and departed. She watched him go. Another frightened man. Not frightened of murder, frightened of truth. The distinction mattered enormously. Later that evening, a breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. Mrs. Agnes Pike requested a private meeting with Inspector Graves. The housekeeper entered his office, visibly nervous. Her hands trembled. She kept glancing toward the door. "You wish to speak with me?" "Yes. Please sit down." She remained standing. "I remembered something." The inspector leaned forward. "What?" Mrs. Pike swallowed. "On the night of the banquet, Mr. Hawthorne asked me to bring coffee to his office." "What time?" "A little after 10. "What happened?" "I knocked." "Did he answer?" "Yes." "And?" "He wasn't alone." Inspector Graves sat upright. "You're certain?" "Absolutely." The housekeeper's voice strengthened. "I heard another person." This was the first direct evidence suggesting Victor had received a visitor before his death. Male or female? "I couldn't tell." "What did you hear?" Mrs. Pike closed her eyes, concentrating. "An argument." The inspector's pencil stopped moving. "What sort of argument?" "I only caught fragments." "Such as?" The housekeeper hesitated. Then she spoke very quietly. "You can't keep it forever." The inspector wrote the sentence down. "Anything else?" "People will find out." "Who said it?" "I don't know." "Continue." Mrs. Pike looked troubled. "There was one final thing." "What?" She drew a breath. "Where is the ledger?" The room became silent. Inspector Graves stared at her. "The ledger?" "Yes." "Are you certain?" "I remember because it seemed such an odd thing to argue about." The inspector thanked her and dismissed her. After she left, he remained seated for a long time. A ledger, a missing notebook, a victim who collected secrets, a room that felt incomplete. The pieces were beginning to connect. Yet not quite. Something remained hidden. That same evening, Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire while guests discussed the latest rumours. Most centred upon Daniel Mercer. The mysterious outsider remained the preferred suspect. The public liked simple explanations. They required less effort. Miss Marple, however, had begun noticing something peculiar. Whenever Daniel's name arose, several people appeared relieved. Not convinced. Relieved. As though they desperately wanted him to be guilty. That observation troubled her, because genuine guilt and convenient guilt were were very different things. Near 9 o'clock, she retired upstairs. As she crossed the second-floor corridor, she noticed a maid emerging from one of the unused storage rooms. The girl carried cleaning supplies. Nothing unusual about that. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the object lying partly hidden beneath a shelf inside the room. Only a corner was visible, black leather, worn, small enough to fit inside a coat pocket. The maid disappeared around the corner. Miss Marple stopped walking. Her eyes remained fixed upon the storage room. For several moments she stood perfectly still. Then she entered. The object remained where she had seen it. A black notebook, its cover damp with dust, its clasp broken. Miss Marple did not touch it. She simply looked, and immediately understood one thing. If this was Victor Hawthorne's missing notebook, someone had hidden it, very recently. She turned and quietly left the room, not to investigate further, not to examine the contents, but to find Inspector Graves. For at last, one of Victor Hawthorne's secrets had begun to emerge from hiding, and whoever had concealed the notebook might soon discover that Miss Marple had started asking the right questions. Chapter 4. Ink Between the Pages. Inspector Graves arrived at the storage room less than 5 minutes after receiving Miss Marple's message. He brought Sergeant Collins, no one else. The notebook remained exactly where it had been found, partly concealed beneath an old wooden shelf. A thin layer of dust surrounded it, though the notebook itself carried noticeably less. The inspector crouched beside it. "You didn't touch it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "One learns not to." "Quite right." Graves carefully lifted the notebook with a handkerchief. It was smaller than he had expected. Black leather, worn corners, a broken clasp, the sort of object a businessman might carry for years. Yet something about it suggested greater importance. Perhaps because so many people had mentioned it, perhaps because it had vanished, or perhaps because someone had taken the trouble to hide it. The inspector opened the cover. Inside, neat handwriting filled page after page. Names, dates, observations, references. Some entries were brief, others extended for several pages. Inspector Graves turned slowly through them. His expression grew increasingly serious. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple remained silent. The inspector looked up. "This is not an account book." "No?" "No." He flipped another page. "It's a catalogue." "Of what?" The inspector gave a humourless smile. "Human weakness." For the next 2 hours, Graves examined the notebook in private. Its contents proved extraordinary. Victor Hawthorne had indeed collected secrets. Not rumours, not idle gossip. Evidence. Some entries concerned business matters. Others described personal indiscretions, financial troubles, marital affairs, questionable transactions, hidden debts, old scandals. Nothing appeared organized for blackmail. Yet the information possessed undeniable power. One name appeared repeatedly, Councillor Harold Baines. Another belonged to Dr. Peter Mallory. A third surprised everyone, Agnes Pike, the hotel's housekeeper. Several pages referenced her specifically. Inspector Graves frowned. That detail made little sense. Mrs. Pike seemed among the least likely people to attract Victor's attention. He continued reading, then abruptly sat upright. A folded paper slipped from between 2 pages. The inspector unfolded it carefully. A letter, unsigned, undated, but unmistakably personal. The contents immediately caught his attention, not because of what they said, because of whom they concerned. By noon, Graves requested interviews with 3 separate individuals. The first was Councillor Baines. The councillor arrived visibly irritated. "I've already answered dozens of questions. You'll answer a few more." Baines sat heavily. The inspector placed the notebook on the desk. Recognition flashed across the councillor's face. Only briefly, but it was enough. "You've seen this before." "No." The denial arrived instantly, too instantly. Graves opened several pages. Mr. Hawthorne kept detailed notes regarding your financial dealings. Baines went pale, the inspector continued. He believed you accepted payments connected to planning approvals. The counsellor swallowed. That accusation is ridiculous. Is it? Silence. Mr. Hawthorne threatened exposure. No. The answer sounded weak. Didn't he? Baines looked away. The inspector already knew. That silence told him more than words. Yet when the interview ended, one fact remained unchanged. The counsellor possessed motive. But motive alone did not make him a murderer. The second interview proved more revealing. Dr. Peter Mallory entered with obvious reluctance. He sat quietly, waiting. The inspector placed the notebook before him. The doctor's face tightened. "You found it." "Yes." "You've read it." "Enough." Mallory sighed heavily. Years seemed to settle upon his shoulders. "What exactly did Victor write about you?" The inspector opened to a marked page. The doctor's expression darkened. "I see. Would you care to explain?" For several moments he remained silent, then spoke softly. 20 years ago, I made a mistake." Inspector Graves listened. The confession that followed surprised him, not because it involved crime, because it involved shame. As a young physician, Mallory had misdiagnosed a patient. The mistake had contributed to a tragic death. No legal wrongdoing had occurred. The medical records supported him. Yet the guilt remained. Victor somehow learned of it years later and recorded it. The doctor looked exhausted. He enjoyed collecting burdens that belonged to other people. Did he threaten you? Not directly, but he liked reminding me that he knew. The inspector studied him carefully. Fear, resentment, embarrassment, all present. Hatred? Possibly. Murderous hatred? Less certain. The interview ended much as the previous one had. Another suspect, another motive, no clear proof. The third conversation proved the most unexpected. Mrs. Agnes Pike arrived shortly after lunch. The housekeeper appeared nervous even before entering. When she saw the notebook, her face lost all colour. Inspector Graves noticed immediately. "So you've seen this before?" She said nothing. "Mrs. Pike." The woman lowered herself into a chair. Her hands trembled. "I hoped he'd destroyed it." The inspector exchanged a glance with Sergeant Collins. "What did Victor record about you?" For several moments she stared at the notebook, then answered quietly, "Not about me." The room became still. "What do you mean?" Tears appeared in her eyes. "About my son." The story emerged slowly. 26 years earlier, Agnes Pike's son had been arrested for theft, a foolish crime committed during desperate circumstances. He served his sentence. Afterward, he left the county. Eventually, he emigrated, built a respectable life, married, raised children. The scandal had long since faded, except for Victor Hawthorne. He kept records, always records. "He used to mention it occasionally," Mrs. Pike whispered. "Never directly, but enough to remind you." "Yes." The housekeeper wiped her eyes. He liked knowing people couldn't escape their past. Inspector Graves remained silent. The statement felt important, not because it identified a killer, because it described the victim. Victims mattered. Understanding them often explained everything. After Mrs. Pike departed, the inspector leaned back. The notebook had created more questions than answers. Nearly every suspect possessed reason to resent Victor Hawthorne, yet none stood apart from the others. Everyone seemed trapped inside the same pattern: secrets, pressure, fear, control. Late that afternoon, another discovery altered the investigation. It came from Sergeant Collins. The sergeant entered carrying a hotel floor plan. "We've re-examined witness statements." "And?" "The office corridor." Inspector Graves looked up. "What about it?" Collins pointed. "Several people claim Daniel Mercer entered this section shortly before 10:30. "Yes." "One witness disagrees." The inspector frowned. "Who?" "Mrs. Langley, a retired schoolteacher. reliable, observant, not prone to imagination. What did she see? The sergeant tapped the map. She insists Mercer came from the opposite direction. Graves stared at the plan. For several seconds he said nothing. Then, meaning he wasn't approaching the office. No, he was leaving another area entirely. Exactly. The inspector sat back slowly. That changed matters. A great deal, because the strongest evidence against Daniel Mercer rested upon his presence near the corridor. If that assumption proved mistaken, the case shifted dramatically. By evening, Graves requested another interview with Daniel. The young man arrived looking tired. Days of suspicion had taken their toll. The inspector studied him. "Where were you at 10:30 on the night of the banquet?" Daniel hesitated. "I've already answered that." "Answer again." The younger man frowned. "I was upstairs." "Doing what?" Silence. A long silence. Then Daniel spoke. "I met someone." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. "That's personal. This is a murder investigation." Daniel exhaled slowly, then said, "Mrs. Pike." The answer stunned everyone in the room, even Inspector Graves. "Agnes Pike?" "Yes." "Why?" Daniel hesitated. "I was trying to find information." "What sort of information?" "About Victor." The inspector stared at him. Daniel continued. "Celia and I believed Victor was hiding something." "What?" "We didn't know." "Then why investigate?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Because Victor wasn't Celia's uncle." Silence. Complete silence. The words seemed to stop the room itself. Inspector Graves felt his pulse quicken. "What did you just say?" Daniel repeated it, slowly, clearly. Victor Hawthorne was not Celia's uncle. The inspector rose from his chair. For the first time since the investigation began, genuine shock crossed his face. "Explain." Daniel nodded. "I'll tell you everything." Outside the hotel windows, evening shadows stretched across the gardens. Inside, the foundations of the entire case had just shifted. Because if Daniel Mercer spoke the truth, then Victor Hawthorne had been hiding something far larger than financial scandals, far larger than blackmail, far larger than a notebook full of secrets, a secret of identity, and somewhere within that secret lay the reason he had died. Chapter 5. The Family That Never Was. The statement hung in the room long after Daniel Mercer spoke it. Victor Hawthorne was not Celia's uncle. Inspector Graves remained standing beside his desk. Sergeant Collins had stopped taking notes altogether. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally, the inspector said, "You understand the seriousness of that claim." "Perfectly." "Can you prove it?" Daniel nodded. "Not completely. Not yet." "Then start at the beginning." The young man drew a slow breath. Outside, the last traces of daylight were fading beyond the hotel grounds. Inside, a secret buried for decades was beginning to emerge. "My father knew a man named Robert Hawthorne," Daniel began. Inspector Graves recognized the name immediately. Victor's older brother. Official records showed Robert had died during the war. The matter seemed straightforward. At least it had. "My father served with him overseas." "During the war?" asked Graves. "Yes." Daniel folded his hands. "Years later, before my father died, he told me something unusual." The inspector listened carefully. According to Daniel, Robert Hawthorne had married shortly before deployment. The marriage was brief. The young wife remained in England. Months later, word arrived that Robert had been killed. The widow disappeared soon afterward. The story itself was not remarkable. War had produced thousands like it. What mattered was the detail that followed. "My father met Robert's wife once, and he never forgot her." Inspector Graves frowned. "Why should that matter?" "Because 30 years later he saw her again." The room fell silent. Daniel continued, "Living under a different name." The inspector exchanged a glance with Collins. "Go on." "She wasn't dead." "No." "She wasn't missing." "No." Daniel's voice lowered. "She was working as a housekeeper in Birmingham." Inspector Graves stared. The implication arrived before the explanation. Mrs. Pike. Daniel nodded. Agnes Pike. For a moment, nobody moved. The revelation seemed almost impossible. Yet Daniel continued speaking calmly. My father recognized her immediately. Did he confront her? No. Why not? Because she begged him not to. Daniel's expression softened slightly. She had built an entirely new life. The inspector leaned forward. And Robert Hawthorne? Daniel hesitated. That is where things become complicated. The next hour produced one of the strangest histories Inspector Graves had encountered. Robert Hawthorne had not died immediately during the war. He had survived for several months after being reported missing. During that period, confusion surrounded troop movements, casualty reports, and military records. Mistakes occurred. Families received inaccurate information. The Hawthorne family believed Robert dead. In reality, he remained alive for a time. Long enough, according to Daniel's father's account, to send letters. Letters that never reached their destination. Letters intercepted. Letters hidden. Inspector Graves listened without interruption. At last he asked, "You're suggesting Victor concealed them?" "Yes." "Why?" Daniel shook his head. "That part I don't know." The inspector considered the possibility. It sounded improbable. Yet history contained countless examples of families doing extraordinary things for money, pride, resentment, or fear. What happened afterward? Robert eventually died. And his wife? She learned the truth years later. The room became quiet again. Inspector Graves understood the significance immediately. If Agnes Pike truly had been Robert's widow, then Victor Hawthorne had spent decades hiding a family secret. And Celia? That question remained unanswered. Daniel supplied it moments later. Celia is Robert's granddaughter. The inspector stared. For the second time that evening, genuine surprise crossed his face. Not Victor's niece. No. Then why claim otherwise? Daniel gave a humorless smile. Because everyone believed the story. The explanation was disturbingly simple. Family myths often survived because nobody questioned them, especially when the people involved benefited from the deception. The following morning, Inspector Graves requested a private interview with Agnes Pike. The elderly housekeeper appeared exhausted. Events had clearly taken their toll. When the inspector mentioned Robert Hawthorne, her expression changed instantly. Years seemed to vanish from her face. Shock, fear, recognition, all appeared at once. "How do you know that name?" The inspector answered carefully. "Because someone finally told us the truth." Mrs. Pike sat down heavily. For a long time she said nothing. Then she began speaking. Not as a witness, not as a suspect, as a woman carrying a burden she had borne for 30 years. Much of Daniel's account proved correct. She had indeed married Robert Hawthorne. She had indeed believed him dead. And years later, she had discovered evidence suggesting Victor had concealed correspondence. Not enough to prove deliberate wrongdoing. Enough to create suspicion, a great deal of suspicion. Victor denied everything. Her voice trembled. He always denied everything. "Did you believe him?" "No." The answer came immediately. "Never. Never." The inspector studied her. "Why remain here all these years?" The old woman smiled sadly. "Because by the time I learned the truth, my life was already elsewhere." The answer felt genuine, painfully genuine. "What about Celia?" Agnes hesitated, then looked directly at him. "She knows." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "How long?" "Several months." That information transformed everything. If Celia knew the family story, then Victor's death affected her very differently than anyone had assumed. Not the loss of an uncle, the death of a man she may have regarded as an enemy. News of these revelations spread more slowly than ordinary gossip. Inspector Graves deliberately restricted information. Even so, whispers emerged. People sensed something significant was unfolding. Miss Marple noticed the change immediately. Conversations stopped when strangers approached. Doors closed more quickly. Certain residents suddenly developed urgent reasons to avoid police interviews. The atmosphere around Hawthorne Hotel shifted. The investigation no longer centered upon a mysterious outsider. It centered upon the family itself. Or what passed for a family. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the hotel's conservatory with Celia Hawthorne. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling. The young woman appeared pale but composed. Far more composed than she had been immediately after the murder. Miss Marple found that interesting. Grief usually moved in the opposite direction. Inspector Graves has spoken with you. Yes. And Daniel? Yes. Celia stared into her teacup. Miss Marple waited. Eventually the younger woman spoke. You know now. Some of it. A faint smile touched Celia's lips. Then you know Victor wasn't my uncle. Miss Marple nodded. For a while neither woman spoke. The conservatory remained quiet except for the occasional chirping of birds outside. Finally Celia said, I hated him. The honesty was startling. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply honest. Miss Marple did not appear shocked. People hated relatives more often than they admitted. What changed? She asked. Celia looked surprised. Changed? You lived beside that hatred for years. Something must have happened recently. The younger woman's eyes widened slightly. Then she laughed, a small bitter laugh. You're clever. Miss Marple smiled politely. No, merely old. Celia considered this. Then answered, he found something. There it was again. Another secret. Always another secret. What sort of thing? I don't know. Truly, truly. For the first time, Miss Marple believed her completely. Celia leaned forward. The week before the banquet, Victor became obsessed. Obsessed. He kept talking about proof. Proof of what? He never said. Miss Marple folded her hands. Proof. The word settled firmly in her mind. Victor had secrets. Victor had records. Victor had a notebook. And now Victor had proof. Proof important enough to frighten multiple people. The question was, proof of what? That evening produced another surprise. Inspector Graves received a telephone call from London. The information concerned Daniel Mercer. At last, investigators had verified his background. The results astonished them. Daniel had told the truth. Every word. His records were clean. His employment history genuine. His military references excellent. No hidden criminal past existed. No false identity. No suspicious connections. The man everyone had assumed was the obvious murderer suddenly appeared far less likely. When Graves shared the news with Miss Marple, she nodded thoughtfully. I suspected as much. You did. People were too eager to blame him. The inspector smiled. I've noticed you pay attention to that sort of thing. Oh yes, she resumed knitting. In villages, when everyone agrees immediately, they're usually wrong. Graves laughed. There was wisdom in that observation, possibly more than he wished to admit. Near midnight, while reviewing notes in his temporary office, the inspector made a troubling discovery. It concerned Victor's notebook, specifically one page near the end, a page he had overlooked before. The final entry consisted of only a few lines, short, abrupt, written less than 24 hours before the banquet. Inspector Graves read it twice, then a third time. The handwriting was unmistakably Victor's. The words were simple, at last confirmed. The photograph proves everything. Tomorrow night I shall confront her. Nothing more, no name, no explanation, no indication of whom he intended to confront. Only that single word, her. Inspector Graves stared at the page. A photograph. Somewhere, a photograph existed. And Victor Hawthorne believed it proved something important enough to justify confrontation, perhaps important enough to provoke murder. Across the hotel, Miss Marple sat awake beside her bedroom window. The village slept peacefully beneath the moonlight. Yet her thoughts remained active. The notebook, the hidden letters, the false family history, the missing ledger, the mysterious photograph. Pieces of a puzzle, many pieces, but not yet a picture. Then another thought occurred to her, a very small thought, the sort that often mattered most. Victor's final note mentioned a photograph, yet no photograph had been found. And people who kill to protect secrets seldom leave dangerous evidence behind. Miss Marple looked out into the darkness. Somewhere in Hawthorne Hotel, another missing object was waiting to be discovered, and she had begun to suspect who might be hiding it. Chapter 6. The Photograph in the Frame. Miss Marple awoke unusually early, not because she had slept badly. Quite the opposite. Experience had taught her that difficult problems occasionally arranged themselves during the night. One simply had to wait for the mind to finish its work. As she dressed, a particular image returned repeatedly. Victor Hawthorne's office, the desk, the open safe, the invitation on the floor, and something else, something she had noticed without consciously examining, a photograph. By breakfast time, she had decided to take a walk. Mrs. Edith Ramsay recognized the expression immediately. "You've thought of something. Possibly. Should I ask?" "You may." "Will you tell me?" Miss Marple smiled. "Probably not," Edith sighed. "You're becoming impossible. I've been impossible for years." With that, she departed for Hawthorne Hotel. The building felt quieter than usual. Several guests had already checked out. Others remained because curiosity outweighed inconvenience. Murder possessed a peculiar effect upon people. It frightened them, yet it also fascinated them. Miss Marple crossed the lobby and proceeded toward the office corridor. Inspector Graves happened to be nearby. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I wonder whether I might see the office." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Have you suddenly developed an interest in bookkeeping?" "Certainly not." "Then why?" "I've remembered something." That answer was sufficient. Graves unlocked the door. The room remained largely unchanged. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air. At first glance, nothing seemed different. Miss Marple walked slowly around the room. The desk, the filing cabinets, the safe. Then her gaze settled upon the wall behind the chair. There were several framed photographs. Most depicted the hotel's history. One showed the grand opening. Another featured wartime staff. A third displayed Victor shaking hands with a local member of Parliament. Miss Marple examined them carefully, then stopped. "How curious." Inspector Graves stepped closer. "What is?" She pointed. One photograph hung slightly crooked, not dramatically, barely noticeable, yet different from the others. The inspector removed it from the wall. Immediately he frowned. The dust pattern behind the frame looked disturbed. "Recent. Very recent." "That's odd." Miss Marple said nothing. Graves carefully opened the backing. A folded piece of paper slipped into his hand. For a moment neither spoke. Then he unfolded it. Inside was a photograph. Not large, not particularly old, yet its significance became obvious immediately. The inspector stared, then stared again. "My word." Miss Marple waited patiently. "What is it?" He handed it to her. The photograph showed 3 people: Victor Hawthorne, Agnes Pike, and a third individual, a woman in her 40s. The picture itself revealed nothing unusual. What mattered was what had been written on the back: a date, a location, and a name. The name was not Agnes Pike, it was Agnes Hawthorne. Miss Marple read it twice, then returned the photograph. "Interesting." The inspector looked at her sharply. "Interesting. Very. Miss Marple, this places Agnes directly into the Hawthorne family." "Indeed. But surely that strengthens motive." "Perhaps." Her tone remained thoughtful. "Or perhaps it strengthens something else." Inspector Graves knew better than to press her immediately. When Miss Marple became vague, it usually meant she was thinking. Very hard. The photograph led to another interview with Agnes Pike, or Agnes Hawthorne, as she had once been. The elderly woman seemed unsurprised when shown the image. "I wondered when you'd find that." Inspector Graves leaned forward. Why was it hidden? I don't know. Victor hid it? Possibly. The housekeeper looked tired, far older than her years. He kept many things. Did he fear it? No. Then why conceal it? Agnes hesitated, then said quietly, because it reminded him. Of what? Her eyes drifted toward the window. Of what he'd done. The room fell silent. Inspector Graves waited. Eventually she continued. When Robert disappeared, Victor changed. How? He became obsessed with control. The old woman spoke carefully, choosing each word, every letter, every document, every conversation. She shook her head. He wanted to know everything. The description matched the notebook perfectly. A man who collected information, a man who feared uncertainty, a man who transformed knowledge into power. Yet one question remained. What had that led to? The answer did not arrive immediately. Instead, another shock struck the investigation. Late that afternoon, a maid discovered something alarming. The incident occurred in the hotel's archive room, a narrow chamber containing decades of records, invoices, guest registers, property documents, storage inventories. The maid entered searching for cleaning supplies. Instead, she found Dr. Peter Mallory unconscious on the floor. The alarm spread rapidly. Staff rushed to the room. Inspector Graves arrived within minutes. So did Miss Marple. Dr. Mallory lay beside a toppled chair. A cut marked his forehead. Papers littered the floor. The room itself appeared disturbed. Not violently, but enough. Dr. Mallory regained consciousness shortly afterward. The doctor seemed confused. Disoriented. What happened? Inspector Graves knelt beside him. That's what we'd like to know. Mallory pressed a hand against his head. I was looking for something. What? The doctor hesitated, then answered. A file. What file? A personnel file. The inspector frowned. Whose? Silence. Then Agnes Pike's. The room became very still. Miss Marple watched carefully. Dr. Mallory appeared genuinely shaken, not merely embarrassed, shaken. What happened after you entered the archive room? Asked Graves. I don't know. You remember nothing. I heard someone. Who? I couldn't tell. The doctor closed his eyes. I turned around, and then everything went dark. Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with Sergeant Collins. Someone had struck Dr. Mallory. The injury confirmed it. Yet why? The answer seemed obvious. He had been searching for information. Information connected to Agnes Pike. Or Agnes Hawthorne. The timing could hardly be coincidence. By evening, the investigation had changed dramatically. A murderer was one thing. An attempted assault during an active investigation was another. Whoever had killed Victor Hawthorne was still frightened, still protecting something, still willing to take risks. Inspector Graves spent hours reviewing witness statements. One detail emerged repeatedly. Several people had seen someone leaving the archive corridor shortly before Mallory was attacked. Unfortunately, descriptions varied. A dark coat, a hat, a tall figure, a short figure. The evidence proved nearly useless. Human observation was remarkably unreliable. Miss Marple often compared it to fishing nets. They caught some facts, allowed others to escape. That night she sat with Inspector Graves in the hotel lounge. A small fire burned despite the warm weather. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. The attack troubles you, she observed. Very much. The inspector rubbed his eyes. It suggests panic. Yes. And panic suggests pressure. Also yes. He studied her. You sound pleased. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I wouldn't say pleased. No, encouraged. The inspector laughed despite himself. Only you could describe attempted violence as encouraging. It means we're approaching something important. He could not argue. She was almost certainly correct. For several minutes they sat quietly. Then Miss Marple asked, what exactly was Dr. Mallory searching for? A personnel file. Specifically, Agnes Pike's employment records. Miss Marple nodded. That answer had bothered her from the beginning. Not because of the file itself, because of the doctor. Why would Peter Mallory suddenly become interested in employment records dating back decades? The question lingered. Then another thought occurred, a very uncomfortable thought. What if Dr. Mallory wasn't looking for information? Inspector Graves frowned. What do you mean? What if he already knew what he would find? The inspector stared. Neither spoke for several moments. Then Graves sat forward slowly. Good heavens! The possibility had never occurred to him. People searched for answers, but they also searched for proof. Victor's final note had mentioned proof. Now Dr. Mallory had been searching historical records connected to the same secret. The connection felt significant. Very significant. Near midnight, another discovery arrived. One of the officers examining Victor's notebook found a loose page tucked into the back cover. Unlike the other entries, it contained only 3 names: Agnes Hawthorne, Peter Mallory, Celia Hawthorne. Nothing else. No explanation. No dates. No notes. Merely those 3 names. Inspector Graves stared at the page, then at the photograph, then at the list again. A pattern existed. He could feel it, yet its meaning remained frustratingly out of reach. Across the corridor, Miss Marple stood at a window overlooking the darkened gardens. Her reflection stared back from the glass. She thought about the photograph, the hidden frame, the missing ledger, the assault on Dr. Mallory. Most of all, she thought about Victor's final note. The photograph proves everything. The phrase no longer sounded quite right, because photographs rarely proved facts. They proved relationships, presence, connections. The value lay not in the image itself, but in what it revealed about people. And suddenly Miss Marple realized something astonishing. Not who the murderer was, not yet, but what Victor had discovered. A possibility so startling that she almost spoke aloud. Instead, she simply smiled, very slightly. For the first time since arriving at Hawthorne Hotel, she believed she understood the shape of the secret. And if she was correct, Victor Hawthorne had not died because of something he knew about the past. He had died because of something he discovered about the present. Chapter 7. A Truth Hidden in Plain Sight. The following morning dawned bright and clear. After several days of uncertainty, sunshine returned to Brindle Ash. The hotel gardens sparkled with dew. Birdsong drifted through open windows. The peaceful appearance contrasted sharply with the unease inside Hawthorne Hotel. The attack on Dr. Peter Mallory had altered everything. Guests spoke more quietly. Staff glanced over their shoulders. Even those previously eager to discuss the murder now seemed cautious. Fear had entered the investigation. Fear changed people. Miss Marple knew that very well. She also knew that fear often revealed more than courage. Inspector Graves spent the morning reviewing evidence related to Daniel Mercer, not because he considered Daniel guilty, quite the opposite. The more thoroughly he examined the young man's movements, the less convincing the case against him became. By noon, the inspector reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Daniel Mercer could almost certainly not have committed the murder. 3 independent witnesses now supported portions of his account. One had seen him upstairs, another had seen him speaking with Agnes Pike, a third placed him in a different corridor during the likely time of death. The timeline simply did not fit. Inspector Graves summoned Sergeant Collins. I think we need to stop treating Mercer as our primary suspect. The sergeant looked surprised. Entirely? Not entirely. Graves closed a file. But nearly. The sergeant nodded slowly. That decision would not please everyone. Half the town had already convicted Daniel in their minds. Unfortunately, investigations were not conducted by public opinion, at least not successful ones. Meanwhile, Miss Marple occupied herself with a seemingly harmless activity. She arranged tea in the conservatory. The guest list appeared unremarkable. Celia Hawthorne, Agnes Pike, Dr. Mallory, Mrs. Edith Ramsay. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Yet Inspector Graves, who had encountered Miss Marple before, recognized danger when he saw it. An elderly lady arranging tea often meant she was arranging something else. He was not wrong. By 3 o'clock, the gathering was underway. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling. Teacups clinked gently. Conversation drifted between ordinary subjects, gardens, weather, local fates. Nothing important. At least, that was how it appeared. Miss Marple listened carefully. Occasionally she asked questions. Never direct ones, never threatening ones. Questions that seemed harmless. Questions that encouraged people to reveal themselves. At one point, she turned to Agnes Pike. "Did you enjoy working at the hotel all those years?" The housekeeper considered. "Sometimes. And the rest?" Agnes smiled faintly. "People are complicated." "Indeed they are." A few minutes later, Miss Marple addressed Dr. Mallory. "You knew the Hawthorne family for many years. Quite a few. Families can change enormously over time." The doctor's hand tightened around his teacup. "Yes, they can become almost unrecognizable." A silence followed. Not long, yet long enough, Miss Marple noticed. So did Celia. Finally, the doctor answered. "That is true." The conversation moved elsewhere, but Miss Marple's attention remained fixed upon him, because Dr. Mallory had reacted differently from everyone else. Not with surprise, with discomfort, a very particular kind of discomfort. After tea concluded, Celia remained behind. The others departed. For a while she stood beside the conservatory windows. Then she turned. "You were watching him." Miss Marple smiled. "Was I?" "Yes. How observant." Celia folded her arms. "What do you suspect?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she asked, "What do you suspect?" The younger woman laughed softly. "That's not fair." "No. It also doesn't answer my question." "Quite right." They regarded one another. Finally Celia spoke. "I think Victor found something about me." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged. "What makes you think that?" "Because of the way he behaved." "Explain." Celia moved toward the window. "The week before the banquet, he kept staring at me." The remark sounded odd, yet not impossible. He said strange things, such as, "Some people spend their lives believing the wrong story." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Anything else?" "Truth eventually finds its own way home." The words lingered in the room. Miss Marple said nothing. Inside her mind, several pieces shifted position. Not enough, but closer, much closer. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves received a report from London. The results concerned historical records, specifically birth records, marriage records, hospital archives, documents connected to the Hawthorne family. The inspector read the report carefully, then a second time, a third. At last he sat back slowly. The information did not solve the case, yet it confirmed something remarkable. Victor Hawthorne had spent months investigating family history, not business records, not finances, family history. The discovery aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicions. When Graves shared the report with her, she nodded thoughtfully. "Yes." The inspector blinked. "Yes? You sound unsurprised." "I've been expecting something similar." He laughed. "Of course you have." Miss Marple resumed knitting. The inspector watched her for several moments, then said, "You know more than you're saying." "Naturally. Care to share?" "Not yet." Graves sighed. "One day, Miss Marple, you will drive a policeman entirely mad." She smiled pleasantly. "Only one?" That evening brought another development, a significant one. An officer examining the archive room discovered traces of mud beneath a cabinet. Normally such a finding would mean little, yet recent weather made it noteworthy. The room had been dry. No staff member recalled muddy footwear. Someone had entered shortly after the rainstorm, someone who should not have been there. More importantly, the mud contained fragments of gravel, the particular variety used on one specific pathway. The rear garden path. The path leading to the old greenhouse. Inspector Graves ordered an immediate search. The greenhouse stood at the far edge of the hotel grounds, an aging structure seldom used except for storage. Dust coated the shelves. Broken pots occupied corners. Spiderwebs stretched between beams. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Then Sergeant Collins found something, a metal box hidden beneath a workbench. The lock had been forced. Inside lay dozens of documents, letters, receipts, photographs, personal correspondence, all carefully bundled. Inspector Graves examined them in growing astonishment. The collection resembled a second notebook, a private archive. Victor Hawthorne's private archive. Someone had hidden it there, perhaps years earlier, perhaps days. Among the papers, one item immediately attracted attention. A sealed envelope bearing Dr. Peter Mallory's name. The inspector opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, a very old letter, written more than 20 years earlier. He read it once, then again, slowly, very slowly. The contents changed everything, not because they implicated Mallory, because they connected him directly to Agnes Hawthorne, or Agnes Pike. The relationship extended far beyond ordinary acquaintance, far beyond professional association. The inspector felt a sudden rush of understanding, not complete understanding, but enough. He requested a private meeting with Dr. Mallory immediately. The doctor arrived shortly before 9 o'clock. He appeared weary. The previous days had clearly exhausted him. Inspector Graves placed the letter on the desk. Recognition appeared instantly. Mallory closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing. Then, "So Victor kept that as well. You've seen it before. Years ago." The doctor sank into a chair. "I hoped it had disappeared. What is it?" Mallory looked older than ever. "A promise." The inspector waited. The doctor gave a sad smile. "One I failed to keep." "What promise?" For a long moment he stared at the letter, then answered, "To protect someone." The room fell silent. "Who?" Dr. Mallory looked directly at the inspector. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Celia." The inspector's pulse quickened. Every major clue now seemed to circle the same person. Celia, the photograph, the notebook, the family records, the hidden documents. Victor's final investigation. All roads led to her, yet not in the way the inspector had once assumed, not as a suspect, as the center of the mystery itself. "Protect her from what?" he asked. The doctor hesitated. A visible struggle crossed his face. Years of silence battled against necessity. Finally he spoke. "From the truth." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "What truth?" Dr. Mallory looked toward the dark window, then back again, and for the first time since the investigation began, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. Not fear of prison, not fear of scandal, fear of revelation. Because the truth he had protected for decades was finally approaching the surface, and once revealed, nothing connected to the Hawthorne family would ever look the same again. Chapter 8. The Secret Dr. Mallory Carried. Inspector Graves closed the office door. Outside, the hotel had grown quiet. Most guests had retired. The corridors lay still beneath pools of yellow lamplight. Inside the office, however, the investigation stood on the edge of a revelation. Dr. Peter Mallory sat motionless. The old letter remained on the desk between them. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Inspector Graves said quietly, "You've protected a secret for many years." "Yes, long enough." The doctor smiled sadly. "I suppose so." He removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades. "You must understand something first." The inspector nodded. "Go on." "Celia is innocent." The statement arrived immediately, firmly, without hesitation. Not the sort of thing one said casually. Graves made no comment. Instead, he waited. The doctor continued, "Everything I did was for her. Why?" Mallory stared at the letter. Because she deserved a normal life. The answer raised more questions than it solved. What danger was she in? The doctor took a deep breath, then finally began. 31 years earlier, Agnes Hawthorne had faced a devastating situation. Her husband, Robert Hawthorne, was gone. Whether through military confusion or deliberate deception hardly mattered anymore. The result remained the same. She was alone, young, poor, and expecting a child. The revelation surprised Inspector Graves. A child? Yes. Dr. Mallory nodded. Robert's child. The inspector sat very still. The implications arrived immediately. The doctor continued. The pregnancy was difficult. Who knew? Very few people. Mallory folded his hands. Agnes feared scandal. Why? Because circumstances were complicated. That, Graves thought, was one way to describe it. The doctor sighed. When the baby was born, there were problems. What kind of problems? For a moment, Mallory seemed reluctant to continue. Then, the child died. Silence filled the room. Inspector Graves said nothing. The doctor stared at the letter. Agnes nearly collapsed from grief. The words emerged quietly. She had lost her husband, then her child. Yes, for several weeks she remained under medical care. The tragedy might have ended there, except it hadn't. That was why they were sitting in this office decades later. What happened next? Asked Graves. Mallory closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Another baby was born. The inspector frowned. To whom? The doctor hesitated. A local woman. Name. No one remembers her now. That answer sounded strange, almost impossible. Yet Mallory continued. The woman died during childbirth, and the child survived. Yes. The inspector's expression changed. A possibility had just appeared. A very uncomfortable possibility. The doctor saw it immediately. You're beginning to understand. Perhaps. Mallory nodded. The infant had no family, no relatives, none willing to claim her. The room became very quiet. Then the doctor said, Agnes took the child. Inspector Graves stared. You mean legally? No. The answer fell like a stone. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, you falsified records. Mallory nodded. Yes. The admission seemed to cost him dearly. Not for money, not for gain. I know. The doctor looked exhausted. It was a terrible decision. Yet you made it. Yes. And the child. Mallory met his gaze. The child became Celia. The office remained silent. Inspector Graves slowly absorbed the revelation. Not Robert Hawthorne's granddaughter, not Victor Hawthorne's niece, not a Hawthorne at all. Celia's entire identity rested upon a decades-old deception. The doctor spoke again. We believed we were doing something kind. Did Agnes know? Everything. Who else? Only me. The inspector looked toward the window. Outside, darkness covered the gardens. Inside, years of assumptions had just collapsed. Victor Hawthorne had spent months investigating family history. Now the reason seemed obvious. He had discovered the truth, or enough of it. And once he found proof, everything changed. When the interview ended, Inspector Graves walked directly to Miss Marple's sitting room. She appeared unsurprised to see him. More troublingly, she appeared unsurprised by what he told her. Ah, she said. So Dr. Mallory finally spoke. The inspector stared. You knew. Not entirely. Miss Marple. She smiled gently. I suspected. Graves sank into a chair. How? Miss Marple resumed knitting. How? The ages never quite matched. What ages? People's memories. The answer sounded infuriatingly simple. Yet she continued. Whenever villagers describe family history, certain details become fixed. Yes, the Hawthorne history seemed strangely uncertain. The knitting needles clicked softly. People remembered events, but not relationships. The inspector considered this. It was true. Numerous witnesses had described the family. Yet few possessed clear knowledge of how everyone actually connected. Miss Marple nodded, a sign that something has been accepted rather than known. The distinction impressed him, because it felt correct, very correct. Still, one problem remained. A secret adoption explains motive. Possibly. It doesn't explain murder. Miss Marple's hands paused. For the first time that evening, her expression grew thoughtful. No, it doesn't. The inspector leaned forward. Then what are we missing? Miss Marple gazed toward the fire. Several moments passed. Then she said quietly, "We are missing the person most frightened by the truth." The following day, Inspector Graves formally interviewed Celia. The young woman listened in stunned silence as the truth emerged. At first she simply stared. Then came disbelief. Then anger. Then something else. Relief. A strange, unexpected relief. "I always knew something was wrong." Her voice trembled. People avoided questions. The inspector watched carefully. "You had suspicions?" "Yes." She looked away. "But not this." Tears appeared. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The sort that accompany shattered certainty. "My entire life." The sentence remained unfinished. No completion seemed possible. The inspector felt genuine sympathy. Few people discovered that their identity had been built upon a lie. Fewer still discovered it during a murder investigation. That afternoon brought a development no one expected. Sergeant Collins entered the temporary police office carrying several evidence bags. "I think we've found something." Inspector Graves looked up. What? The invitation. For a moment the inspector frowned, then remembered. The ballroom invitation found near Victor's office window. The object Miss Marple had noticed on the first night. "What about it?" Collins placed a report on the desk. "We re-examined it. And? There are fingerprints." The inspector sat upright. Until now, the invitation had seemed insignificant. A dropped object. Nothing more. Yet Collins continued. "Most belong to Victor. Naturally, one does not." Silence. The inspector stared. "Can you identify it?" "Not yet." The sergeant hesitated. "There's something else." "What?" "The print was made after Victor handled the invitation." The implication struck immediately. Someone had touched it inside the office, near the time of death. Perhaps during the murder itself. Inspector Graves felt excitement rising. At last, a tangible clue. Not speculation, not gossip, evidence. Later that evening, Miss Marple wandered through the hotel gardens. The setting sun painted long shadows across the gravel paths. The air smelled faintly of roses. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction. The puzzle was nearly complete. Not solved. Nearly. There remained one final inconsistency. One detail refusing to settle. As she passed the old greenhouse, her attention drifted toward the gravel path. Then she stopped. Completely stopped. Her eyes narrowed. A memory surfaced, not from the murder. From the attack on Dr. Mallory. The mud. The gravel. The hidden archive. The greenhouse. And suddenly, the final inconsistency vanished. Everything aligned. Every clue. Every lie. Every secret. Miss Marple stood very still. For several moments she simply gazed at the pathway. Then she smiled. A small smile, the sort that appeared whenever human behavior finally revealed itself, because the answer had never been hidden in documents, or photographs, or family records. The answer had been hidden inside a very ordinary mistake. A mistake only one person could have made. And at last, Miss Marple knew exactly who had killed Victor Hawthorne. She also knew something else. The murderer had become desperate. Desperate enough to strike Dr. Mallory. Desperate enough to hide evidence. Desperate enough to take further risks. Which meant there was still danger. Real danger. That evening, she requested a private meeting with Inspector Graves. The message she sent was brief, only a single sentence. "I believe the time has come to arrange a small gathering." When the inspector read it, he smiled despite himself. because he had heard similar words before, and they usually meant only one thing. Miss Marple was preparing her final test. Chapter 9. The Gathering in the Drawing Room. Inspector Graves received Miss Marple's note shortly after 7 o'clock. By now he had learned not to ignore such messages. Whenever Miss Marple requested a gathering, something important followed, sometimes very important. He found her in the hotel lounge, seated comfortably with her knitting, the picture of harmless old age. The inspector no longer trusted that appearance. "Good evening, Inspector. You believe you've solved it?" Miss Marple smiled. "I believe I understand it." "Which is not the same thing?" "Quite." The distinction irritated him slightly. "Care to explain?" "Tomorrow evening," the inspector sighed. "I suspected you'd say that." Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly. "There are still one or two matters that require confirmation." "What sort of matters?" "The sort that make people reveal themselves." That answer did not improve his mood, yet experience suggested she was right. Human beings frequently supplied the missing evidence themselves, given the opportunity. Invitations were delivered the next morning, not formal invitations. Requests. Inspector Graves asked several individuals to attend a private meeting in the drawing room after dinner. Among them, Celia Hawthorne, Daniel Mercer, Dr. Peter Mallory, Agnes Pike, Councillor Harold Baines, Mrs. Edith Ramsay, several senior hotel staff. The recipients reacted differently. Some appeared curious, others nervous, one or two distinctly alarmed. Miss Marple paid careful attention. Fear was often more revealing than guilt. Throughout the day, she conducted a series of seemingly casual conversations. The first involved Agnes Pike. They met briefly in the rose garden. The elderly housekeeper appeared exhausted. Events had aged her noticeably. "You look troubled," said Miss Marple. "I am troubled." "Because of the investigation?" Agnes shook her head. "Because of the truth." They walked slowly along a gravel path. For several moments neither spoke. Then Agnes said, "I never intended harm." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "I know." The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears. Everything began with kindness. A sad smile touched Miss Marple's face. Many disasters do. The remark lingered between them. Not accusation, not judgment, simply observation. Human beings often created terrible consequences while pursuing good intentions. Later she encountered Dr. Mallory. The doctor appeared restless, more restless than before. That interested her. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. You've slept poorly." He blinked. "How do you know?" "The same way I know when roses require watering." The doctor laughed despite himself. Then his expression faded. "Perhaps I deserve poor sleep." Miss Marple studied him. "No." The answer surprised him. "You don't think so?" "I think you've punished yourself quite sufficiently." For a moment, genuine emotion crossed his face. Relief. Unexpected relief. Then he asked, "Do you know who killed Victor?" Miss Marple looked toward the distant hotel. "Yes." The doctor's eyes widened. "Then why haven't you told the police?" "Because people tell the truth most readily when they believe nobody knows it." The answer clearly unsettled him, which was precisely why she gave it. That evening the drawing room slowly filled. A fire burned in the grate. Outside, darkness settled across the hotel grounds. Inside, conversation remained subdued. Everyone sensed the significance of the occasion. Inspector Graves stood near the fireplace. Sergeant Collins occupied a position by the door. Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair. The arrangement appeared informal. It was not. By 8 o'clock, all expected guests had arrived. Inspector Graves closed the door. Silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke. Her voice remained gentle, almost conversational. "I believe we have all spent rather a great deal of time considering Victor Hawthorne." Several people shifted uncomfortably. She continued, "An understandable mistake." The room became still. "A mistake?" asked Baines. "Yes." Miss Marple smiled politely. We have focused upon the victim, naturally, whereas the real mystery concerns the living. No one answered. The statement felt oddly significant, yet its meaning remained unclear. Miss Marple folded her hands. When Mr. Hawthorne died, everyone immediately assumed his secrets mattered. She glanced around the room. In fact, they mattered very little. Several faces registered surprise. Even Inspector Graves looked uncertain. Miss Marple continued, "The notebook distracted us. The family history distracted us. The adoption distracted us." Her voice remained calm. "All important matters, but not the reason for murder." The silence deepened. Councillor Baines frowned. "Then what was the reason?" Miss Marple turned toward him. "Fear." A simple word, yet it changed the atmosphere instantly, because everyone in the room understood it. Victor Hawthorne inspired fear. Many people had admitted as much. Miss Marple nodded. Not fear of exposure, fear of discovery. Inspector Graves watched carefully. The distinction mattered. He could feel it, though he had not yet grasped why. Miss Marple continued, "Victor spent months investigating family history. Why?" No one answered. She supplied the answer herself. Because he believed something was wrong. Her eyes moved towards Celia. The young woman lowered her gaze. He discovered the adoption. Eventually, Miss Marple nodded. That revelation shocked him. Yet it did not lead to murder. Several people exchanged confused glances. The case seemed to be moving backward, not forward. Miss Marple was accustomed to such reactions. The truth rarely followed a straight road. She rose slowly from her chair. The movement drew every eye. "Let us consider the photograph." Inspector Graves immediately understood. The hidden photograph. Victor's final note. The photograph proves everything. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A curious sentence. Very curious. She looked toward the inspector. Because photographs rarely prove facts. Graves nodded. "You said that before." "Indeed." She turned back to the room. "They prove relationships." The drawing room remained silent. Miss Marple continued. "Victor believed the photograph proved something important. He was mistaken." A murmur spread through the room. Miss Marple raised one hand. The whispers ceased. The photograph did not prove what he thought it proved. Instead, it encouraged him to investigate further. She paused. And that investigation eventually led him somewhere unexpected. Inspector Graves felt a sudden tightening in his chest, because at last he understood, or almost understood. Miss Marple looked toward Dr. Mallory, then Agnes Pike, then Celia. Finally she said, "Victor discovered a truth that existed in the present, not the past." The distinction landed heavily. Several people visibly reacted. Miss Marple noticed, especially one person, only one. For the next 10 minutes, she reconstructed the investigation, the notebook, the hidden records, the attack on Dr. Mallory, the missing documents. Each clue received careful examination, each assumption dismantled, slowly, methodically, like threads being removed from a tapestry, until only the essential pattern remained. Inspector Graves found himself watching faces rather than listening. Miss Marple was doing the same. The room contained nervousness, confusion, impatience, and one other emotion, panic. Very carefully concealed, yet unmistakable. At last Miss Marple reached the attack on Dr. Mallory. "The assault interests me particularly." The doctor's expression darkened. "It wasn't intended to kill." "No," Miss Marple nodded. "It served another purpose." "What purpose?" asked Graves. "To recover something." The inspector stared. "Recover. Not conceal. Recover. A subtle difference. An important one," Miss Marple continued. "The attacker believed Dr. Mallory had found evidence." Her gaze moved slowly across the room, evidence connected to Victor's final discovery. No one spoke. The room seemed frozen. Then Miss Marple smiled. A small, almost apologetic smile. There is only one difficulty. What difficulty? Asked Baines. The evidence never existed. Confusion swept the room. Miss Marple let it settle, then delivered the blow. Victor Hawthorne was wrong. The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Shock spread outward. What do you mean? Asked Inspector Graves. Miss Marple looked directly at him. I mean the entire chain of events began with a mistaken conclusion. Silence. Absolute silence. Several people stared openly. Even Graves required a moment. Then understanding flickered. Not complete understanding, but enough. Victor discovered something, believed something, investigated something, and he had been wrong. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward one individual. Only briefly, yet Inspector Graves saw it, and suddenly his pulse quickened, because for the first time he understood exactly where she was leading them. The room, however, did not. Not yet, and somewhere among the assembled guests sat a murderer whose composure was beginning to crack. Chapter 10. The Mistake That Killed Victor Hawthorne. The silence in the drawing room had changed. It was no longer the silence of attention, it was the silence of pressure. Inspector Graves felt it most sharply. Something was about to break. Miss Marple remained standing, calm, composed, almost gentle. Yet her eyes were no longer wandering. They were fixed, not on the group, on one person within it. Victor Hawthorne's final mistake. That was where everything led. She spoke again. Victor believed he had discovered proof. Her voice remained steady. Proof of identity. A faint stir moved through the room. Inspector Graves straightened. Identity. Not finance. Not scandal. Not inheritance. Identity. Miss Marple continued. He thought he had uncovered something that would change how one person understood themselves. Her gaze did not shift, but he misunderstood what he was seeing. A pause. A deliberate one. Entirely. Celia's hands tightened slightly in her lap. Dr. Mallory lowered his eyes. Agnes Pike remained still. Inspector Graves felt the case tilting again, but this time in a different direction. Miss Marple turned slightly. Victor Hawthorne had become convinced that Celia was connected to him in a very particular way. A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Celia looked up sharply. What? Miss Marple regarded her kindly. He believed you were not only part of his family history, a pause, but part of his present. Celia shook her head. I don't understand. I think you do, Miss Marple said softly. Silence followed. Inspector Graves stepped forward slightly. Miss Marple, are you suggesting Victor believed Celia was… He stopped. The implication was already forming. Miss Marple nodded once. Yes. A long pause. Then she added, he believed she was his daughter. The reaction was immediate. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Celia stood abruptly. That is impossible. Agnes Pike closed her eyes. Dr. Mallory looked down at the floor. Inspector Graves felt the room tighten again. Miss Marple raised one hand gently. Please. The single word was enough. Celia hesitated. The room held its breath. Miss Marple continued. Victor Hawthorne had found fragments of truth. But fragments are dangerous things. They suggest patterns that may not exist. Her eyes softened slightly. In this case, they suggested a relationship that was never real. Inspector Graves spoke carefully. Then what did he discover? Miss Marple turned toward him. That is the crucial question. A pause. Victor discovered that Agnes Pike had once used another name. Agnes lowered her head. Agnes Hawthorne. A murmur. But that was not the end of his discovery, Miss Marple continued. He also discovered a photograph. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the inspector. The photograph that misled him. Graves remembered it instantly. 3 figures. Victor. Agnes. A third woman. Miss Marple nodded slightly, as if confirming his thoughts. Victor assumed what he wanted to assume, that the child in the background of that period belonged to him. Celia shook her head again. That doesn't make sense. It does, when viewed without context, Miss Marple said gently. And Victor had no context. Silence again. Then Miss Marple added the final correction. He did not realize the child he was investigating was not his bloodline. A pause. But part of someone else's entirely. Inspector Graves felt something shift inside the room. Slowly, carefully, like a mechanism aligning. Miss Marple continued. Victor's mistake was not discovering a secret. It was misinterpreting it. She turned slightly toward Agnes Pike. Isn't that correct? Agnes did not answer immediately. Then, quietly, yes. Celia stared. Dr. Mallory exhaled sharply. Inspector Graves felt the final shape beginning to form. Miss Marple's voice softened. And when Victor became convinced of this imagined truth, he began to act upon it. Her gaze sharpened slightly. That is when he began threatening people. A pause. Not because he understood the truth, but because he believed he did. Inspector Graves spoke slowly. And someone knew he was wrong. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Silence tightened again. The inspector looked around the room. Something had changed. Not the theory. The atmosphere. Fear had shifted position. It was no longer general. It had become focused. Miss Marple sat down again, very calmly. I think we are now in a position to consider the night of the murder. Her tone changed slightly, more precise, more deliberate. Victor Hawthorne left the ballroom with a belief that he was about to confront someone. She looked at each face in turn. He believed he held proof. A pause. But the proof was flawed. Her gaze settled, and someone realized that very quickly. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Realized what? Miss Marple answered without hesitation. That Victor was about to destroy a life based on a misunderstanding. Silence. Then she added, and that he could not be allowed to do so. The words landed heavily. Graves felt it now. The final direction. He looked at Miss Marple. Who? The question hung in the air. Everyone turned slightly. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked a question of her own. Who in this room had the most to lose from Victor speaking that night? No one answered. She continued gently. Not from inheritance, not from scandal, but from identity. Her gaze lifted and stopped. Inspector Graves followed it, slowly, reluctantly. Celia Hawthorne. The room tightened. Celia stepped back. What are you saying? Miss Marple's voice remained soft. Only that Victor Hawthorne believed something about you. And someone knew he was wrong. Celia shook her head. No. The word came too quickly, too sharply. Inspector Graves saw it immediately. Miss Marple saw it too. The reaction had arrived before thought. Miss Marple stood again. Miss Hawthorne. Celia froze. You were the last person to see Victor alive before he returned to his office. Celia's breathing quickened. I did not, Miss Marple continued gently. You followed him, didn't you? Silence. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Celia? The young woman's voice broke slightly. I went to speak to him. About what? Her eyes flickered. About the photograph. A pause. And what did you tell him? Celia hesitated, then whispered, I told him it was wrong. The room became still. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. And he did not believe you. Celia's voice rose. He said he had proof. Silence. Inspector Graves felt it now. The turning point. Miss Marple spoke softly. He showed you the photograph. Celia closed her eyes. And in that moment, Miss Marple continued, you realized he would not stop. A pause. So you went to his office. Celia shook her head violently. No. But Miss Marple continued. And you followed him in. Silence again. This time heavier. Celia opened her eyes. Tears formed. You don't understand. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Then help us understand. The room waited. Celia's voice dropped. He was going to tell everyone. A pause. And I couldn't let him. Inspector Graves spoke quietly. Because he was wrong. Celia hesitated, then whispered, because it didn't matter if he was wrong. Silence shattered. Every face turned. Miss Marple did not move. Inspector Graves felt the final certainty form. Miss Marple spoke very softly. "That is the truth, isn't it?" Celia said nothing, but she did not deny it, and that was enough. Outside, somewhere in the quiet hotel corridors, footsteps approached. Inspector Graves turned slightly. Sergeant Collins entered. He looked pale. "Inspector, we found something in the office safe." Graves took the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, different from the others, clearer, newer, and on it, Celia Hawthorne holding a silk cord, the same type found around Victor's neck. Silence fell completely. Inspector Graves closed his eyes. The case was over. Miss Marple spoke gently. "It is always the smallest misunderstanding that leads to the largest consequences." Celia sank into a chair. No protest, no denial, only quiet collapse. The drawing room remained still. Outside, Brindle Ash continued as if nothing had happened. Inside Hawthorne Hotel, the truth had finally been spoken, and it had changed everything. Chapter 11. What truly happened in the office. For several moments after Sergeant Collins produced the photograph, nobody spoke. The drawing room seemed suspended in time. Celia sat motionless. Inspector Graves remained standing beside the fireplace. Miss Marple alone appeared unsurprised. Not satisfied, not triumphant, simply unsurprised. At last, Graves broke the silence. "I think we need absolute clarity." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed." The inspector looked towards Celia. "Miss Hawthorne, before we proceed further, there is something I must ask." Celia slowly raised her head. The tears remained, but some of the panic had faded. Only exhaustion remained now. "Did you kill Victor Hawthorne?" The question hung heavily in the room. Everyone waited. Celia opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally she whispered, "No." Shock rippled through the gathering. Even Inspector Graves looked startled. The answer had not been expected. Across the room, Councillor Baines gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Now really, please," said Miss Marple gently. The councillor fell silent. Miss Marple's attention never left Celia. "You went to the office?" "Yes." "You argued with Victor?" "Yes." "You saw the photograph?" "Yes." "You left him alive?" Celia nodded. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "Yes." The room erupted immediately. Questions, objections, disbelief. Inspector Graves raised a hand for silence. When the room settled again, he turned to Miss Marple. "You believe her?" "Entirely." "Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because she has finally begun telling the truth." The inspector stared. A strange feeling had begun creeping into his thoughts. The uncomfortable sensation that the solution he had accepted moments earlier might not be the solution at all. Miss Marple rose slowly. "I think it may help if we return to the beginning." Nobody objected. "The investigation," she continued, "has been distorted by assumptions." She glanced toward Graves. "The first assumption concerned Daniel Mercer." The inspector nodded reluctantly. "Quite right." "The second assumption concerned family history." Another nod. "The third assumption concerned motive." Miss Marple paused. "And the fourth assumption concerned opportunity." The room became very still. "Because opportunity was the foundation of every accusation against Celia." Miss Marple continued. "Miss Hawthorne certainly had motive." "Yes." "She certainly confronted Victor." "Yes." "And she certainly had reason to fear his actions." Again, "Yes." "But motive is not murder." A pause. "And opportunity is not proof." Inspector Graves felt his pulse quicken, because he suddenly remembered something that had troubled him from the first day. The invitation near the window. Miss Marple walked toward the centre of the room. Victor Hawthorne was strangled while seated at his desk. She looked around. A surprisingly difficult thing to accomplish. Several people frowned. The point had never occurred to them. Miss Marple continued. Most murders of passion are messy. People stand, they struggle, they move. She glanced toward the inspector, but Victor remained seated. Graves nodded slowly. That was true. Very true. The office was unusually tidy, Miss Marple continued. Far too tidy for a confrontation that became murder. The inspector's eyes widened slightly. He had thought exactly the same thing on the first night. Miss Marple turned towards Celia. When you visited Victor's office, did you threaten him? No. Did he threaten you? Yes. The answer came instantly. What did he say? Celia swallowed. He said the truth would come out. And then? He showed me the photograph. A pause. I told him he was wrong. Miss Marple nodded. And he refused to listen. Yes. What happened next? Celia closed her eyes. For a moment, she seemed to relive the scene. I left. The room remained silent. He was angry. Very angry. But alive? Yes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Thank you. She turned away. Inspector Graves felt the pieces moving again. Not randomly. Purposefully. Toward something he had failed to see. Then Miss Marple addressed a different person. Dr. Mallory. The doctor looked up sharply. Yes? You told us someone attacked you in the archive room. Correct. And you were searching for records. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. What records? The doctor hesitated, then answered, birth records. A murmur spread through the room. Miss Marple continued, not employment records. No. The doctor lowered his head. No. You lied. Yes. Why? Mallory looked miserable. To protect someone. Miss Marple nodded. The answer was expected. Not Celia. The doctor looked up. For the first time that evening, genuine alarm appeared in his face. Miss Marple saw it. So did Inspector Graves. And suddenly Graves felt a cold sensation travel down his spine. Because at that moment he understood. Not the whole truth. Just enough. Enough to realize they had been looking at the wrong person. Again. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the fireplace. When I was a little girl, she said, there was a farmer in St. Mary Mead who kept blaming foxes whenever his chickens disappeared. Several people looked confused. The inspector did not. He had heard such stories before. The difficulty, Miss Marple continued, was that there were no foxes. A faint smile touched her lips. Only a very clever neighbour. Silence. She looked directly at Dr. Mallory. The doctor's face had become deathly pale, and now everyone noticed it. Everyone. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Victor Hawthorne was wrong about Celia. Yes. He misunderstood the photograph. Yes. But during his investigation, she paused, he discovered something else. The room seemed to stop breathing. Something far more dangerous than the adoption. Something far more dangerous than the family deception. Something that explained the notebook, the missing records, the attack, the fear, everything. Miss Marple's eyes settled on Dr. Mallory and did not move. Inspector Graves slowly turned toward him. The doctor's hands were trembling, not slightly. Violently, Miss Marple spoke softly. Victor discovered who Celia's real father was. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Dr. Mallory closed his eyes, and in that terrible silence, everyone finally understood why he had been afraid from the very beginning. Not afraid of scandal. Not afraid of exposure. Afraid of the truth. The real truth. And suddenly the murder looked very different indeed. Chapter 12. The Last Secret of Hawthorne Hotel. No one spoke. The drawing room had fallen into a silence so complete that even the crackling of the fire seemed startlingly loud. Every eye rested upon Dr. Peter Mallory. The doctor's face had lost all colour. His hands trembled. Not with age, not with illness, with fear. The fear of a man who had spent decades protecting a secret and suddenly realized that secret had reached the end of its life. Inspector Graves stepped forward, slowly, carefully. Dr. Mallory? The doctor closed his eyes. For a long moment he did not answer. Then he whispered, yes. The single word echoed through the room. Not a confession, not yet, but close enough that everyone felt it. Miss Marple remained seated. Her voice, when she spoke, was almost kind. Victor Hawthorne never intended to expose the adoption. The doctor nodded faintly. No, he discovered it accidentally. Yes, and then he continued digging. The doctor looked down. He always did. There was bitterness in the remark. Years of bitterness. Miss Marple folded her hands. The adoption led Victor toward old records, old letters, old medical documents. She paused. And eventually toward Dr. Mallory. The doctor's shoulders sagged. Inspector Graves remained silent. The entire room was listening. Miss Marple continued. Victor initially believed he had uncovered a family scandal. He was mistaken. But while pursuing that mistake, he stumbled onto something real. Her eyes settled on the doctor. He discovered who fathered the child Agnes adopted. Silence. The doctor slowly lowered his head. Me. The word barely emerged. Yet it struck the room like a gunshot. Agnes Pike gasped. Celia stared in disbelief. Even though Miss Marple had led everyone toward the conclusion, hearing it spoken aloud carried a different weight. Dr. Mallory looked broken, entirely broken. The story emerged slowly. Years earlier, before Agnes Hawthorne lost her child, another tragedy had unfolded in the district. A young, unmarried woman became pregnant. Dr. Mallory had been involved with her. The relationship had been brief, private, and foolish. The woman died during childbirth. The infant survived. That infant was Celia. Dr. Mallory had known. Agnes had known. No one else. When Agnes lost her own child, grief consumed her. When the orphaned baby appeared, circumstances collided. An impossible decision became reality. Agnes raised the child. Dr. Mallory helped protect the deception. Years became decades. The secret remained buried, until Victor Hawthorne began investigating. Inspector Graves finally spoke. So Victor discovered the truth. The doctor nodded. Not all of it. What do you mean? He discovered enough. Mallory swallowed hard. He found references in old medical correspondence. The inspector remembered the hidden archive, the old letters, the sealed envelope. Everything suddenly aligned. Victor confronted you? Yes. The answer came immediately. When? The night of the banquet. A murmur swept through the room. Miss Marple nodded quietly, exactly as she had expected. The doctor drew a shaking breath. He called me to the office. The memory clearly tormented him. He believed he had solved everything. A bitter smile crossed his face. He was very pleased with himself. No one interrupted. He showed me documents, the photograph, the records. The doctor's voice weakened. He thought Celia was his daughter. Several people shifted uneasily. Victor's misunderstanding had truly begun everything. But then, Mallory paused. The room waited. Then I realized he was close. The doctor looked towards Celia. His eyes filled with tears. He was close to discovering the real truth. Silence. He intended to continue. He intended to tell people. He intended to keep digging. The doctor's voice cracked, and eventually he would have reached her. Celia stared, unable to speak. Inspector Graves asked quietly, "So what happened?" The question everyone had been waiting for. The doctor closed his eyes. When he spoke again, the words emerged slowly, painfully. "We argued." No one moved. "He accused me." I denied it. He laughed. The doctor looked suddenly older, far older. Then he told me he would prove it. The room remained silent. I panicked. There it was, the word that explained everything. Not hatred, not greed, not revenge. Panic. Miss Marple had recognized it from the beginning. The doctor continued. I picked up the silk cord. His hands trembled violently now. I don't remember deciding. I remember only fear. Tears ran down his face. When it was over, his voice broke. He was dead. No one spoke. The confession filled the room, heavy, final, terrible. Inspector Graves waited, then asked the remaining question. The invitation. The doctor nodded weakly. Yes. Why was it near the window? The answer surprised everyone. I dropped it. Silence. The doctor gave a miserable laugh. A ridiculous thing, Miss Marple smiled sadly. Human beings often betrayed themselves through ridiculous things. He grabbed it during the struggle, the doctor continued. It fell. I stepped on it. When I moved away, I picked it up. The inspector understood immediately. The fingerprint. The misplaced invitation. The clue Miss Marple had noticed on the very first night. The smallest detail. The detail that never quite fit. And the attack on you? Asked Graves. The doctor lowered his eyes. I staged it. Several gasps followed. Mallory nodded miserably. I thought Victor had hidden evidence. The archive? Yes. I searched for it. When someone approached, I panicked. The inspector frowned. You struck yourself? The doctor almost smiled. No. An old shelf collapsed while I was moving boxes. A brief silence followed. The absurdity felt strangely human. So the attack never happened. No. Mallory shook his head. I invented it. The explanation accounted for everything. The confusion, the lack of witnesses, the contradictory descriptions. Everything. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Miss Marple rose, slowly. The mystery was finished. The truth stood exposed. No further deductions remained, only understanding. She looked toward Dr. Mallory, not with condemnation, not with approval, simply understanding. You loved her. The doctor's eyes filled again. Yes. Not Agnes. Not romantically. Not anymore. Celia. The daughter he could never publicly acknowledge. The daughter he had protected all her life. The daughter whose existence Victor Hawthorne had nearly uncovered. Miss Marple nodded. And that love destroyed you. The doctor said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Inspector Graves eventually stepped forward. Duty remained duty, no matter how tragic the circumstances. Dr. Mallory. The doctor stood, slowly, quietly, without resistance. The case was over. Several weeks later, Hawthorne Hotel reopened. Life in Brindle Ash gradually returned to normal, or as close to normal as villages ever managed after murder. Councillor Baines discovered that several investigations awaited him. Daniel Mercer and Celia left the district together for a time. Agnes Pike retired peacefully. The hotel eventually passed into new ownership. As for Miss Marple, she spent her final morning in Brindle Ash, sitting beside the garden roses with Mrs. Edith Ramsay. The summer sun warmed the flowers. Bees drifted lazily between blossoms. For a while neither woman spoke. Then Edith asked, "Do you think people are naturally good or naturally bad?" Miss Marple considered carefully. At length she smiled. "I think people are simply people." "That sounds rather disappointing." "Not at all." Miss Marple looked toward the distant hotel. "People possess kindness, cruelty, love, fear, often all at once." Edith nodded thoughtfully. "And Dr. Mallory?" Miss Marple watched a bee settle upon a rose. The answer came softly. "He committed a terrible crime." A pause, but it began with love. The two women sat quietly for a while. Then Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The mystery was finished. The village would continue. And somewhere, she reflected, another apparently ordinary gathering was probably already preparing the next tragedy. Because human nature never changed, only the names did. The end.